Yolanda Saldivar. In the early 1990s, a young Tejano singer from Corpus Christi was rewriting the history of Latin music. Known as the Queen of Tejano, Selena Quintanilla Perez was not only a Grammy-winning superstar but also a rising entrepreneur. She owned and operated her own fashion line and two boutiques, Selena, etc., that were growing rapidly in Corpus Christi and San Antonio. To manage this growing world, Selena trusted Yolanda Saldivar, first as the president of her official fan club, and later as the manager of Selena etc. boutiques. But behind that trust, Saldivar was secretly embezzling money, betraying the very star she claimed to admire. The Quintanilla family discovered that she had been embezzling funds from both organizations, and on March 31, 1995, Selena Quintanilla Perez agreed to meet Saldivar at a Days Inn motel in Corpus Christi, Texas, to retrieve financial records that Saldivar had previously refused to turn over. During that meeting, Saldivar delayed producing the documents by claiming she had been raped in Mexico and asked Selena to drive her to a nearby hospital for an examination. They returned to the motel later that morning, where Selena again demanded the financial records. At that point, Saldivar removed a Taurus Model 85 .38 caliber revolver from her purse and fired a hollow point bullet, striking Selena in her upper right back near her shoulder blade. Selena staggered into the motel lobby and collapsed. She was rushed to Corpus Christi Memorial Hospital, where she was pronounced dead at 1:05 p.m. from blood loss and cardiac arrest. Saldivar was arrested later that evening after a standoff of approximately 9.5 hours with Corpus Christi police officers and FBI negotiators. At her trial, which was moved to Houston because of the intense publicity, prosecutors argued that Saldivar had murdered Selena after being confronted about misappropriated funds, while the defense claimed the gun discharged accidentally. She was convicted of first-degree murder on October 23, 1995, and sentenced to life in prison, with eligibility for parole only after serving 30 years. She became eligible for parole in March 2025 but was denied release. Her next parole review is scheduled for March 2030. Genene Jones. In the early 1980s, a troubling pattern emerged in pediatric wards across San Antonio and Kerrville, Texas, where infants and toddlers admitted for routine care were suddenly suffering medical crises that could not be explained. They had seizures, bleeding, and sudden cardiac arrests. At the center of these unexplained tragedies was a pediatric nurse named Genene Jones. Doctors noticed that children collapsed most often during her shifts, and suspicions deepened as mortality rates soared when she was on duty. Genene Jones, born in 1950, worked in pediatric clinics where she had access to powerful drugs, and investigators later determined that she injected children with lethal or near-lethal doses of medications like succinylcholine and heparin. The prosecution's theory was that she created medical emergencies so she could appear as the heroic nurse who rushed in to save lives. But instead of saving them, her actions killed. One of the clearest cases was the death of 15-month-old Chelsea McClellan in September 1982 after a routine doctor's visit in Kerrville, where she administered an injection and Chelsea never recovered. Authorities began investigating and ultimately connected Jones to dozens of suspicious cases. Though she was suspected of killing as many as 60 infants, prosecutors focused on the cases they could prove in court. In 1984, Jones was convicted in Bexar County of injuring a child, 4-week-old Rolando Santos, and in Kerr County of murdering Chelsea McClellan. She received a 99-year sentence for the injury case and a 60-year sentence for the murder. She was set to become eligible for release after serving only a portion of those terms, but as her release date approached, Bexar County prosecutors moved to block her freedom. In 2017, she was indicted for 5 additional infant murders, and on January 16, 2020, she entered a plea in Bexar County Court, admitting guilt in the 1981 murder of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer. In exchange, the other charges were dismissed, and the judge sentenced her to life in prison. Christine Marie Paualia. In July 2003, the Clear Lake area of Harris County was shaken by a crime that would later be remembered as one of Texas's most disturbing teenage murder cases. Christine Marie Paolia, a 17-year-old student once crowned Miss Irresistible at her high school, entered a house at 3706 Millbridge with her boyfriend, 21-year-old Christopher Lee Snyder. Inside were 4 teenagers: Tiffany Rowell, her boyfriend Marcus Bracella, Marcus's cousin Adalbert Sanchez, and Tiffany's close friend Rachel Colarutis. Paolia had once been welcomed by Tiffany and Rachel when she struggled socially at school, but their friendship had soured. On July 18, 2003, the pair carried out a brutal ambush, shooting and killing all 4 victims in a matter of minutes. The killings went unsolved for years, and by 2005, Paolia had descended into drug addiction while Snyder fled from Texas as rumors swirled about his involvement. In 2006, just before police moved to arrest him, Snyder died by suicide in Kentucky. That same year, investigators received a tip implicating Paolia, and she was arrested in San Antonio on July 19, 2006. Court records show she confessed that she and Snyder were present at the murder scene, although she later tried to downplay her role. Christine Marie Paolia was sentenced on October 13, 2008 to 40 years in prison, avoiding a harsher sentence only because the jury chose not to impose life without parole. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice record confirms she is not eligible for parole until the 2040s, ensuring decades behind bars for her role in the Clear Lake murders. Diane Michelle Zamora. In November 1995, 16-year-old Adrienne Jones, a high school sophomore and cross-country athlete from Mansfield, Texas, was lured from her home late at night. She believed she was meeting a friend, but instead she was confronted by David Graham, an Air Force Academy cadet, and his girlfriend Diane Michelle Zamora, a midshipman at the Naval Academy. Graham had confessed to Zamora that he once had a brief sexual encounter with Adrienne, and Zamora demanded retribution. Together they formed a deadly plan that ended with Adrienne's murder. Adrienne was driven to a remote area in Grand Prairie where Graham attacked her. When she tried to escape, she was shot twice in the head. Zamora was present during the assault and later admitted her involvement. For months, the case remained unsolved until fellow cadets reported that Zamora and Graham had spoken about the killing, and in September 1996, investigators arrested both of them. Diane Zamora was tried and found guilty of capital murder on February 17, 1998. She received an automatic sentence of life imprisonment with eligibility for parole only after 40 years. Kimberly Clark Saenz. In April 2008, at the DeVita Lufkin Dialysis Center in Angelina County, Texas, patients began suffering sudden and unexplained medical emergencies. Investigators later determined that a nurse, Kimberly Clark Saenz, was secretly injecting bleach into the dialysis lines of vulnerable patients. Several patients collapsed and at least 5 died as a result of these actions. Saenz, who had previously faced disciplinary issues in her nursing career, quickly became the focus of suspicion. Staff observed that emergencies spiked when she was on duty, and medical records, patient logs, and testimony began to show a chilling pattern. She was indicted in 2009 on charges that included 1 count of capital murder covering the deaths of multiple patients and multiple counts of aggravated assault for the harm inflicted on others. During her trial in Angelina County, prosecutors presented evidence that bleach, a common cleaning solution at the clinic, was deliberately introduced into patient lines, causing fatal complications. On March 30, 2012, a jury found Kimberly Clark Saenz guilty of capital murder and aggravated assault, and on April 2 she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with additional 20-year sentences for the aggravated assault convictions. Caitlin Marie Armstrong. On May 11, 2022, professional cyclist Anna Mariah Mo Wilson was found shot to death inside a friend's apartment in East Austin, Texas. Hours earlier, she had gone swimming and had dinner with fellow cyclist Colin Strickland. Investigators later learned that Strickland had been in an on-and-off relationship with 34-year-old yoga instructor Caitlin Marie Armstrong, and jealousy had been brewing for months. Police discovered that Caitlin's black Jeep Cherokee had been captured on surveillance near the apartment minutes before Anna was killed. When officers interviewed Caitlin the next day, she was released on a technical issue, and within days she disappeared. Using a fraudulent passport, Caitlin boarded a flight from Newark to Costa Rica, where she altered her appearance and tried to reinvent herself as a yoga teacher. For 43 days, Caitlin remained a fugitive until the U.S. Marshals tracked her down at a hostel in Santa Teresa, Costa Rica, on June 29, 2022. She was arrested and extradited back to Texas to face trial. During her November 2023 trial in Travis County, prosecutors presented evidence that ballistics from Armstrong's firearm matched the bullets recovered from Wilson's body, and phone data placed Armstrong near the crime scene. They argued she had acted out of jealousy and carried out a calculated murder. Caitlin Armstrong was found guilty of first-degree murder, and on November 16, 2023, the court sentenced her to 90 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Erica Yvonne Shepard. In June 1993, 19-year-old Erica Yvonne Shepard and her accomplice James Dickerson targeted 43-year-old Marilyn Sage Meager inside her Houston apartment. Meager was found on June 30, 1993, beaten and strangled with a cord. Her car and valuables all stolen. The investigation quickly connected the crime to Yvonne Shepard and Dickerson, and Yvonne Shepard was arrested soon after. At trial in Harris County, prosecutors presented evidence that Yvonne Shepard actively participated in the robbery and murder. The defense argued she had been pressured by Dickerson, but the jury was persuaded by the brutality of the killing and her involvement. On March 3, 1995, the jury convicted Shepard of capital murder, and she was sentenced to death. Brenda Delgado. On September 2, 2015, 35-year-old dentist Kendra Hatcher was shot and killed in the parking garage of her uptown Dallas apartment. Investigators quickly uncovered that this was not a random act of violence, but a calculated murder for hire plot. The mastermind was Brenda Delgado, a dental hygienist student who had once dated Ricardo Paniagua. After their breakup, Paniagua began a new relationship with Hatcher, and Delgado grew obsessed, jealous, and unwilling to let go. Evidence later showed she stalked Hatcher, kept track of her movements, and became determined to eliminate her romantic rival. Delgado recruited 2 accomplices to carry out her plan. She promised Christopher Love money and drugs to act as the triggerman, and enlisted Crystal Cortez as the getaway driver. On that September night, Christopher Love ambushed Hatcher in the garage, shooting her in the head, while Cortez waited in the vehicle. After the murder, Delgado fled to Mexico, sparking an international manhunt. Because of an extradition agreement with Mexican authorities, she could not face the death penalty. She was captured in April 2016, returned to Dallas, and placed on trial. She was found guilty of capital murder on June 7, 2019, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Christopher Love, being the shooter, received the death penalty, while Crystal Cortez accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Taylor Renee Parker. In October 2020, the town of New Boston, Texas, was shaken by a crime that investigators described as one of the most brutal they had ever seen. 27-year-old Taylor Renee Parker had spent months pretending to be pregnant, staging ultrasounds and even hosting a gender reveal party to convince her boyfriend and family of the lie. On the morning of October 9, she drove to the home of 21-year-old Reagan Michelle Simmons Hancock, who was 8 months pregnant and preparing to welcome her second child. Inside that home, Parker attacked Reagan with overwhelming violence, stabbing her more than 100 times before cutting her unborn baby from her womb with a scalpel. Reagan's 3-year-old daughter was in the house at the time and later found her mother's body. Parker fled the scene with the infant, who did not survive, and she was stopped by a Texas state trooper on U.S. Highway 82 not long after the killing, and officers discovered the baby in her vehicle, prompting an immediate arrest. She was indicted and found guilty, and on November 9, 2022, Parker was formally sentenced to death. Ana Trujillo. On June 9, 2013, Houston police were called to a luxury high-rise condominium near downtown, where they found 62-year-old University of Houston research professor Dr. Alf Anderson lying dead in his living room. His face and head were covered in puncture wounds, and investigators quickly identified the shocking weapon, a stiletto-heeled shoe. Prosecutors later revealed that he had been struck at least 25 times with the sharp heel, leaving deep wounds that caused his death. The woman responsible was his girlfriend, 41-year-old Ana Trujillo. Officers arrested her at the scene and charged her with murder. During trial in Harris County in March 2014, prosecutors described Trujillo as jealous and prone to violent outbursts, arguing that Anderson had been brutally beaten in a rage. The defense countered that she had acted in self-defense during a drunken fight, but jurors were shown photographs of the bloody stiletto, which prosecutors called a deadly weapon. She was found guilty of murder and sentenced on April 11, 2014 to life in prison. Lynn Carty. The British citizen, originally from St. Kitts, was living in Houston, Texas when she orchestrated a deadly scheme in May 2001. According to court records, she feared losing her boyfriend and believed that having a baby would secure the relationship. Having falsely claimed pregnancies before, she set her sights on Joanna Rodriguez, a 25-year-old woman who had just given birth. On May 16, 2001, Carty and 3 accomplices entered Rodriguez's Houston apartment, and they kidnapped her along with her newborn son. Rodriguez was bound, gagged, and placed in the trunk of a car, and hours later she died of suffocation inside that trunk, while her infant son was later discovered alive in a car seat nearby. Investigators quickly identified Carty as the mastermind. Evidence showed she recruited men to help with the abduction, and testimony linked her directly to the plan. Prosecutors argued that her motive was to steal Rodriguez's baby and claim him as her own. Carty was arrested within days of the crime and charged in Harris County with capital murder and kidnapping. On Tuesday, February 19, 2002, the jury found her guilty of capital murder and she was sentenced to death. Magen Fieramusa. In December 2019, an Austin mother, Heidi Broussard, disappeared shortly after dropping off her child at school, and her best friend, Magen Fieramusa, quickly became the focus of suspicion. Investigators discovered that Fieramusa had been pretending to be pregnant and claimed she was due around the same time as Heidi. Police later found Heidi's body stuffed inside a duffel bag in the trunk of a car at Fieramusa's Houston area home. Inside the house, they discovered Heidi's newborn daughter, alive, whom Fieramusa had attempted to pass off as her own child. Authorities determined that Fieramusa had strangled Heidi and staged the abduction in order to steal the baby. Fieramusa was arrested on December 19, 2019, and charged with murder and kidnapping. She eventually accepted a plea deal to avoid the possibility of a death sentence, and was sentenced to 55 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. As part of the plea, she waived her right to appeal. Verna Deianne McLean. On April 17, 2012, outside a pediatric clinic in Spring, Texas, 30-year-old Calamarie Golden had just left her newborn's checkup when she was suddenly confronted. Witnesses reported that a woman stepped forward, pulled a gun, and shot Golden multiple times in broad daylight. Golden screamed for help, calling out for her 3-day-old son Keegan as she collapsed near her pickup truck. The shooter then grabbed the infant and sped away in a vehicle. Kala Golden died at the scene, her final words pleading for her baby's safety. The killer was soon identified as Verna Dean McLean, a 30-year-old licensed vocational nurse from Houston. Investigators learned she had told her fiancé she was pregnant, though she was not, and had decided to steal a newborn to cover up the lie. Authorities discovered that McLean had carefully planned the abduction and carried out the attack without hesitation. She was arrested within hours at her sister's apartment in Harris County, where baby Keegan was found alive and unharmed. McLean was indicted for capital murder and originally faced the death penalty. Prosecutors described the crime as calculated and merciless, but in 2013 a plea agreement was reached. On November 19, 2013, McLean pleaded guilty to capital murder in Montgomery County, and she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Deborah Janelle Jeter. On June 5, 2009, Deborah Janelle Jeter, a 32-year-old mother from Hill County, Texas, drove her 2 daughters, 12-year-old Kelsey and 13-year-old Kirsten, to an abandoned farmhouse off Highway 77, just north of Hillsboro. The visit came only days after a court granted her unsupervised visitation rights, despite a troubled history that included a prior suicide attempt and ongoing custody disputes. Inside that empty house, Janelle launched a violent knife attack on both girls. Kelsey was stabbed repeatedly and died at the scene, while Kirsten suffered critical injuries but managed to survive after emergency surgery. Moments later, Janelle herself dialed 911, telling the dispatcher she just killed her children. When deputies arrived, they found her calmly waiting outside, smoking a cigarette, as her daughters lay inside bleeding. The Hill County grand jury indicted Janelle on charges of capital murder and attempted capital murder. Prosecutors initially considered seeking the death penalty, and a judge ordered evaluations of her competency and sanity while she was held in the county jail. Ultimately, Janelle chose to avoid trial, and on May 26, 2010, she pleaded guilty in open court. A judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring she would never be released. Amber Guyger. The former Dallas police officer entered the wrong apartment on September 6, 2018, and shot 26-year-old accountant Botham Jean inside his own home. Jean, a native of St. Lucia and a PricewaterhouseCoopers employee, was sitting in his living room when Guyger, still in uniform after her shift, opened fire. She later told investigators she believed she had walked into her own unit and mistook Jean for an intruder. The Texas Rangers arrested Guyger 3 days later, and she was indicted and found guilty of murder on October 1, 2019, and the next day, October 2, she was sentenced to 10 years in prison. She became eligible for parole in October 2024, but was denied after serving half of her sentence. Reports confirm she will remain in custody, with her next parole review set for 2026. The Jean family also pursued civil action, and in November 2024, a Dallas County jury awarded nearly $100 million to Botham Jean's family in a wrongful death lawsuit against Guyger and the city of Dallas. Erin Caffey. In the early morning hours of March 1, 2008, terror descended on the Caffey family home in Rains County, Texas, where 16-year-old Erin Caffey had spent weeks plotting the murders of her own parents and 2 younger brothers. Her motive was rooted in her parents' disapproval of her relationship with her 18-year-old boyfriend Charlie Wilkinson. Erin believed that if her family were gone, she and Wilkinson could be together without interference. That night, Wilkinson, accompanied by his friend Charles Allen Wade and Wade's girlfriend Bobby Gail Johnson, entered the Caffey home while Erin waited outside. Penny Caffey, Erin's mother, was shot multiple times and then stabbed. Her sons, Matthew, who was only 13 years old, and Tyler, 8 years old, were shot in their bedrooms as they slept. The attackers then set the house on fire. Erin's father, Terry Caffey, was shot 5 times but miraculously survived. Despite his wounds, he crawled nearly 300 yards through the woods to a neighbor's house to raise the alarm. When authorities apprehended Wilkinson, he quickly confessed, implicating Erin as the mastermind behind the plot. Investigators later confirmed that Erin had pressured him repeatedly to kill her family and had promised a future together if he carried out the murders. Erin Caffey pleaded guilty to capital murder in 2009, and because she was only 16 at the time of the crime, she was not eligible for the death penalty. She received 2 consecutive life sentences, with the possibility of parole after serving 40 years. Her boyfriend, Charlie Wilkinson, and Charles Wade were sentenced to life without parole, and Bobby Johnson was also sentenced to life in prison. Darlie Lynn Routier. On June 6, 1996, in Rowlett, Texas, police were called to the home of Darlie Lynn Routier after a frantic 911 call, and when they arrived, they found 6-year-old Devin and 5-year-old Damon with multiple stab wounds. Devin was already dead, and Damon died shortly after, despite efforts to save him. Their mother, Darlie, had superficial injuries, including a cut on her neck. She told investigators an intruder had broken into the home, attacked the children, and fled. Investigators, however, found no signs of forced entry, and a bread knife from the Routier kitchen tested positive for fiberglass, consistent with the family's cut window screen, suggesting the scene had been staged. Blood evidence indicated that someone had attempted to wipe down areas around the sink, and the state argued that Darlie inflicted her own wounds to support the intruder's story. Prosecutors presented financial troubles as a possible motive and highlighted a video showing Darlie spraying silly string and laughing at her son's gravesite just days after the murders, describing it as evidence of callousness. The defense countered that her behavior was a misguided attempt at celebrating her child's life, not proof of guilt. She was convicted and sentenced to death by lethal injection on February 4, 1997. Kimberly Diane Cargill. In June 2010, Cherry Walker, a 39-year-old woman with intellectual disabilities, was found dead on a rural roadside in Smith County, Texas. Her body had been doused with lighter fluid and set on fire. Investigators quickly identified Kimberly Cargill, a 43-year-old home health aide and mother of 4, as the prime suspect. At the time, Cargill was facing a custody battle and a Child Protective Services hearing. Cherry Walker had been subpoenaed to testify about Cargill's neglect and violent behavior. Prosecutors argued that Cargill killed Cherry to prevent her from speaking in court. Evidence showed that Cargill picked Walker up from her apartment in Tyler, struck her, bound her, and transported her in the trunk of her car before burning her body in a remote area. The Smith County jury heard testimony that Cargill had a history of arrest for assault, child endangerment, and reckless conduct. In May 2012, after a capital murder trial in the 241st District Court of Smith County, the jury found Kimberly Cargill guilty, and on May 30, 2012, the same jury sentenced her to death for the murder of Cherry Walker. Brittany Marlowe Holberg. In November 1996, 23-year-old Brittany Marlowe Holberg murdered 80-year-old retired electrician A.B. Towery Sr. inside his Amarillo, Texas home. Prosecutors said Holberg, who struggled with drug addiction and had prior arrests for prostitution and theft, stabbed Towery more than 60 times with knives, scissors, and a butcher's fork, and then forced part of a lamp pole down his throat. After the killing, she fled and was arrested days later in Abilene, hiding at a friend's apartment. At her 1998 trial in Potter County, jurors heard graphic testimony and saw crime scene photographs that underscored the brutality of the attack. On March 18, 1998, Holberg was convicted of capital murder, and later that month the jury sentenced her to death. She was transferred to the Women's Death Row Unit in Gatesville, Texas, where she remained for more than 25 years. On March 13, 2025, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit issued a divided opinion vacating her conviction and death sentence. The majority found that prosecutors had failed to disclose critical evidence under the Brady Rule, including benefits given to a paid informant whose testimony was central to the state's case. The ruling remanded the case for further proceedings, leaving Holberg's legal status uncertain. Although the Texas Department of Criminal Justice continued to list her as sentenced to death, the Fifth Circuit's decision means she no longer has a valid death sentence in place. Her case now awaits further action in the state courts, and after nearly 3 decades, her future remains unresolved. Melissa Lucia. On the night of February 17, 2007, in Harlingen, Texas, paramedics rushed 2-year-old Mariah Alvarez to the hospital after she was found unresponsive at home with bruises all over her body, and despite efforts to revive her, she was pronounced dead. Within hours, investigators accused her mother, Melissa Lucio, of abuse, arrested her that same night, and interrogated her for hours. During questioning, she admitted to spanking her children but denied killing Mariah. Prosecutors portrayed her as a violent, neglectful mother and pointed to her difficult past and prior involvement with Child Protective Services as evidence of a pattern of abuse. In 2008, a Cameron County jury heard the case. The state's medical experts argued that Mariah's injuries could not have been caused by an accidental fall, as the defense claimed, but were the result of repeated abuse. The jury convicted Lucio of capital murder, and on August 12, 2008, she was sentenced to death. On April 25, 2022, just 2 days before her scheduled execution, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted a stay, ordering a new review of her case. The legal landscape shifted dramatically in 2024 when a Cameron County judge signed findings of fact and conclusions of law acknowledging that prosecutors had suppressed crucial evidence and that Lucio had been denied a fair trial. Then, on October 16, 2024, Judge Arturo Nelson concluded that Lucio was actually innocent and recommended that her conviction and death sentence be overturned. On November 14, 2024, after more than 16 years in custody, Melissa Lucio walked out of jail. Yet even after her release, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice still listed her on women's death row because the final decision rests with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. Her case remains one of the most contested capital convictions in Texas, raising profound questions about wrongful convictions, flawed forensic evidence, and the limits of the death penalty. If you enjoyed this and want to see more interesting videos, I'm going to be posting every day on this channel. I would really appreciate it if you like and subscribe. Thank you very much.